Right, well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. Today we're going to be looking at a sort of big picture question, in that we're looking at the Roman army, its role in terms of particularly the Principate, first into the 3rd centuries AD. And within that, there's the broader academic debate that's still not really settled. People just have their entrenched views about whether or not Roman emperors and the empire were capable of formulating some sort of grand strategy, some long-term planning. We'll come on to that in a minute, but it's worth thinking about the Roman army and what it was for, because there is no other institution comparable to it within the Roman system. Any form of civil bureaucracy, even in late antiquity, when it's much, much larger than it is under the Principate, is still smaller in terms of overall numbers than those people who are paid to wear a sword and weapons belt and military boots by the emperor. The army is 300,000 plus, 350,000, that sort of size, and it is posted out to different parts of the empire over considerable distances. It's in existence permanently, and this is controlled, and it's significant because obviously we'll talk about this more in a few weeks' time when we look at civil wars and the fall of the empire. The army is not just a means of security for an emperor and for his empire, it is also a threat to him. And in certain periods, obviously 1st century BC, the republican system is torn apart by civil war. You look at the 1st and 2nd centuries AD and you say, well, they only have one civil war in each of those, or one big one. But you go into the 3rd century and afterwards, and it is an experience through which everyone would live if you reached adulthood. They are that frequent. And more Roman emperors are killed or forced to commit suicide by the actions of Roman armies led by another Roman than they ever are by foreigners. So the army is important, and the army also presents some problems, because when we tend to look at the empire and suggest it's fairly primitive in terms of communications, in terms of the ambitions of what the emperor and government wanted to do, then the army raises some questions that don't neatly fit into that sort of idea. So we're going to be looking at the question of grand strategy, we're going to be looking at the question of the Pax Romana, Roman peace, and the balance to which warfare was used for rational, practical reasons, or it was a source of glory, of achievements for an emperor. And all of these things are significant. So we're going to look more generally at that. But let's start with one incident in the 1st century AD, taken from Tacitus. In the Annals, he talks about Corbulo, who's governor of Lower Germany. Now, obviously, that's lower from the Roman point of view, so it's the north bit, not the south bit. And Corbulo responds to raiding into Roman territory by not only defeating some of the raiders, but then putting together a field army from the 2 legions and auxiliaries that he has in his province, and leading it beyond the River Rhine into territory that is not directly administered by the Roman Empire, fights a campaign, wins some victories, and starts to establish praesidia, garrisons, in territory that is not formally part of the Roman Empire. He then gets a letter from the Emperor Claudius telling him, Sir Claudius firmly prohibited fresh aggression against the Germans, that he ordered our garrisons to be withdrawn to the west bank of the Rhine. Corbulo was already arranging his encampment upon hostile ground when the dispatch was delivered. He was taken by surprise, but although a multitude of consequences poured upon his mind, danger from the emperor, contempt from the barbarians, ridicule on the side of the provincials, he made no remark except, happy the Roman generals Beatos before my time, and gave the signal to retreat. Oh, no, sorry, we didn't need that. Right, I got all the quote on one page. So that's from Book 11 of the Annals. It's interesting in several ways. In the first place, the only reason that the Emperor Claudius, all those hundreds of miles away in Rome, knows about this is because his governor of Lower Germany has sent a report and a dispatch to tell him this is what I'm doing. And therefore, so this information has to get from beyond the Rhine to Italy, to Claudius, who processes it, decides, I don't want this to happen, and sends letters of instructing Corbulo not to do this, pull the army back, and you aren't to establish any bases to the east of the Rhine. That message then has to get back to Corbulo, who responds, obeys, and pulls the army back, all within the course of campaigning season. So this has all happened in several months, but nevertheless a relatively short period of time. but not quick in the modern sense. We're used to instant communication globally. The Roman world is very different. No information can travel faster than somebody can gallop a horse or sail a ship if it can go by sea. What's also interesting is the considerations that the Roman commander has. Obviously, he's thinking back to the good old days of Julius Caesar and the like, where if you read the Gallic war commentaries, it's essentially well, there's this problem, this ally has appealed to me, so I need to go and fight a bit further away and a bit further away from my province. That leads me to bridging the Rhine, going into Germania, crossing the Channel, coming to southern Britain. All of those things he presents as in the interests of the Roman people, but as decisions made by the governor on the spot. And I go and do these. I will be accountable for this in the end, and I'm telling you all, this is what I should be doing, this is for the good of the Roman state. But he's not been instructed to do this in a specific way. Governors under the Republic would receive mandata, instructions from the Senate. In the imperial period, they get them from the emperor. So you're sent out to your province with, this is what you're supposed to do. And if you look at Cicero's letters for his time in Cilicia, there are some quite specific things. So for instance, he's told to look after the personal security of King Ariobarzanes of Cappadocia. And there are letters about that because you get them within the same day. He meets the king and the king says, no, there's nothing to worry about. And then the next night the king says, I'm in danger of being murdered. But anyway, that's another thing. So there are reactions, but Cicero presents all of this later on, after it's all happened. And decisions then are made collectively by the Senate. So each time they could debate, whereas there is one person in charge in this respect. Now let's look and remind ourselves of this Roman Empire. So this is in AD 14 roughly, just to give a sense of scale. So this is at Augustus's death, and you have areas like Thrace, Cappadocia. These are allied communities. Now Augustus in the Res Gestae will include delegations from India coming and sort of submitting to him and saying, well, it's all part of Rome's imperium, my empire, aren't I great? They tend to interpret the sense of Roman power in a very generous way. However, they do consider allied kingdoms are very much part of the Roman state. So we tend to mark on here directly administered areas, but it's bigger than that. But if we go on to death of Nero, you filled in some of the gaps with directly ruled provinces. You've added part of Britain in. But essentially, the empire has reached its geographical extent by the time of Augustus's death. There are some additions later on. There are some changes in areas being ruled by an allied king or dynast to turned into a directly ruled province, and sometimes it goes back to being a client king and then comes back to being a province. There are those changes. You get the addition of Britain under Claudius, pushed up further north than that, obviously, after Nero's death. You'll have Dacia under Trajan. Before that, Domitian will have filled in more of this area. Now, for us, looking at the world in a map is an entirely natural thing. And even to the extent where, in this day and age, the north is at the top. So the opposite to the Germania Inferior is actually at the top. That's how we convey lots of information. I mean, now we have the advantage, you can actually have satellite images, you can physically see what it looks like from a high place. Obviously, these are not available to the Romans. Now, what have I got next? Right, nope, okay, we'll come back in a second. So you're dealing with an immensely large area of land. Just as, again, it's one of those throwaway flip comments, but it is significant. No other power in history has controlled all the lands around the Mediterranean. So the Roman Empire is unusual because it's really big, and it's even more unusual because it lasts a very long time. And to a great extent, what you see here with a few additions is the area that lasts for those centuries. Bear in mind, Britain is one of the last additions to the Roman Empire, and the Romans are here for 3.5 centuries and a bit. That's an incredibly long period of time. So the Roman Empire is highly successful, and obviously all these people out there haven't spontaneously decided that they wanted to be Roman. A lot of this has occurred through conquest, and a lot of this is exceptionally violent. Again, go back to Caesar, read his account of the wars in Gaul. He kills a lot of people. I mean, I think it's Pliny, doesn't he? Comes out with the figure that Julius Caesar probably has won more battles and killed more people than any other Roman general, and he kills 1 million and enslaves 1 million, this sort of thing. And even if the figures are, it's a very large number, the Romans themselves, with that tradition of quantifying success that you get in the lists of achievements in a triumph and in inscriptions, they have this sense of going out. They have done this by force, and they maintain it by force. They have a very large army. So this then leads to the grand strategy debate that all really kicked off in a formal sense in 1970. Oh, dear me. Right, how do I do that? Do I make it go back up? Ooh, fancy. Sorry. I'm very impressed by technology. It's just magic as far as I'm concerned. So, Luttwak's book, The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, 1976, didn't invent the whole thing, but he formalized the debate. He was a modern international relations expert, strategist, advisor to more than one American administration, particularly the Reagan one. He saw a lot of things in Cold War terms, because that was the big debate going on at the time. That was the reality. But he looked with an incredible depth and perception for somebody who was not a classicist or an archaeologist at the evidence that was out there, at the literature, at the patterns of distributions of forts, evidence for garrisons of different provinces, and tried to produce a systematic development of how the Romans control their empire. Now, he assumed that they were primarily defensive and that all this is about, in the imperial period, is essentially protecting what you've got with occasional additions of more territory. Now, there's obviously a basic truth to that, because, looking back at those maps, the empire doesn't get that much bigger. Compared to the expansion of particularly 1st and 2nd centuries BC, when the Romans acquire a lot of provinces, up until the death of Augustus, they seem to expand a lot. Afterwards, it is occasional. Doesn't stop, but it is occasional. And if you look at the eastern frontier, which we can't really do in detail, there is a gradual extension of Roman directly administered territory. It keeps moving ever further east. Not by big distances. They never go and occupy Ctesiphon, Seleucia on the Tigris, the sort of heartland of the Parthian and then the Sasanian empires, even though those areas, particularly Seleucia, is probably the 3rd biggest Greek city in the world. Culturally, this had been the heartland of the Seleucid Empire for centuries before the Parthians get there. And culturally, you can see it as coherent. In many ways, it ought to be part of one empire, and yet in the Roman period, it never is. It's always kept separate. But anyway, that's a good thing. Now, Luttwak's very methodical, very systematic, full of diagrams, we'll look at lots of them, provoked a very strong reaction. He got 2 reviews in JRS, which is very unusual. And then since then, I've put covers of a couple of the books on, but there's an awful lot of other stuff. A lot of this debate has been carried out through articles rather than books. But you had Dick Whitaker's Frontiers of the Roman Empire, that, again, it says in the subtitle, a social and economic study, rather denying the importance of empires altogether, seeing them not as places where they're boundaries, but more as areas for commerce across and this sort of thing, and exchange. Ben Isaac's Limits of Empire emphasized the Roman army as an occupation force, as a controlling force, looked very much with a particular emphasis on the Jewish tradition from the Talmud and elsewhere, suggesting that the Roman army was seen as a hostile invader, essentially, even for centuries, even when they're in a province for generation after generation, and that banditry as a form of rebellion was a problem in many areas, and then argued that Roman thinking wasn't particularly rational, they didn't understand geography, it was far more to do with prestige and honor for the emperor, but also that a lot of the army is actually deployed not to defend against outside threats, but to control the population inside. And then you have people like Susan Matten, Rome and the Enemy, that emphasizes, again, the ideology element within the emperor's position. The emphasis, after all, imperator, which we get emperor, it begins as victorious general, that title. And the perception in so much of the imperial propaganda on victory. You know, you have the Ara Parcis Augusti, but the Res Gestae is almost entirely a list of conquests or people who submitted to me because I'm so big and strong that they felt they had to, they were scared. So that's where the debate. Now we're not going to, that's one of Luttwak's plan from his first phase of the how the Roman defensive system works, where they're using client states and tribes. partly he freaked out a lot of classicists because we start putting diagrams like this in a book and it's not our comfort zone. You know, this is a bit, it's like, it's even worse with history students. If you present them with a graph, they sort of basically say, well, I didn't do maths at A level, why is this, why is this coming anywhere near me? It shouldn't. And it's partly what we get used to. We get used to studying things in our own particular way. We're familiar with certain types of presentations of evidence, of ways of thinking, and not with others. Now, what we're going to do is not go through the debate, look at each author, this one said that, this one came with that view. We're going to try and look at the whole question and consider what our evidence is, how we understand what the Roman army is doing, where it is, and then maybe working out what are the limitations, what are the cultural aspects that affect how the Romans think, what are the practical aspects in terms of how much could you control. More than any of the other talks, although we've had an archaeological element in a lot of them, an awful lot of this debate comes down to evidence from the ground, the excavation. Here you've got Mile Castle, what are we? We're 39, aren't we? With housesteads up there. And you've got obviously big monuments like Hadrian's Wall with all the different complexes. You've got plenty of Roman forts. Here's a view of South Shields, Arbea, south of the River Tyne, reconstructed barrack block and part of the commander's house there. It's evidence where we can say there's a Roman army base here. This base seems to be designed to accommodate a unit of this sort of size. And there are bigger bases where there's a whole legion. There are smaller bases, forts we call them, where there's an auxiliary unit of a tenth the size of a legion. There are peculiarities. You can't see it quite so well in this, but you can from if you look at these buildings, they've got the big buttresses along the sides. You go to one or two Roman sites, you will very quickly recognize a Roman military granary. That's what these are. Now, we normally think of a fort like South Shields designed to take an auxiliary unit. That's its base, and that's where everybody can live. In fact, under Septimius Severus, this is packed full of granaries. It seems to become not accommodation for soldiers, but storage for a much larger group of soldiers. Now, Septimius Severus will obviously die in York, spends his last few years campaigning in what's now Scotland, so a large army operating in this area needs lots of supplies. We only know this because this was the first fort to be almost completely excavated. Even an auxiliary fort, it's a tenth the size of a legionary base, is big. Archaeology is expensive and takes time. Because the plans of these forts are quite formulaic, have I got the note? Okay, we're going to Caerphilly Castle next, right. There was a tendency to find a few traces. Oh, we've got the commander's house here, we've got the barrack block here, and then fill in everything else to a standard plan because more or less they fit. It's just not quite exact. But when we get more information, we realize actually there are phases and different things are happening. So archaeological evidence presents us with an awful lot of information that we simply don't get in the surviving literary sources for the Principate because they don't go into that sort of detail, but it's a different type of evidence. And remember as well, although we have Tacitus for the 1st century, we don't have the equivalent of Caesar's detailed narratives of campaigns for the army of the Principate at all. Closest we get is Josephus that deals with a Jewish rebellion, mainly deals with sieges. And for the 2nd century AD, major campaigns occur, the big Imperial Wars in Dacia in the east, about which we know very, very little indeed. You know, people even try and glean stuff from Lucian's satirical book about the writing of history to try and understand Lucius Verus's campaign against the Parthians, because we know so little, even though one of the two emperors of the day is in charge and a large part of the Roman army gets transferred from all over the empire to go and fight this against the biggest other state out there, and next to nothing is known about it. So we're dealing with different types of evidence. Just to think about Roman forts, obviously they've got walls around them, but they are fundamentally different to medieval castles. This is Caerphilly, not far from me. I think it's the biggest castle in Britain, though you can't quite see it from this angle. You look at a medieval castle, what stands out are the big defences, the walls, the towers. Caerphilly's got a concentric design. This is Chepstow. Can't see it, but the first part is one of the earliest Norman defensive structures in Britain, because it was begun in 1067. Built on a hill, built on a ridge above a river. strong point with strong defences. You look at Roman army bases. This is a model of the one at Halton from the Augustan period. You've got your wall around, and if you're some angry barbarian running up, that's still a formidable obstacle, but it's not the scale of defences of a medieval castle. We call them fortresses for legionaries, we call them forts for auxiliaries. They are not primarily defensive. What they are is packed full of buildings. Accommodation for people, storage space, granaries, the like. There we go, there's a plan of housesteads on Hadrian's wall. Same thing, commander's house, Principia, possibly the hospital, granaries up there with the buttresses again. Lots of barrack blocks. It's lots of space. There is a wall around it, but it's also built on the reverse slope. It isn't on the highest ground around, it isn't on the most obvious defensive position. It sprawls because it's there to accommodate people. That's a model which gives you an idea of, again, the impression of the thing. So it's, you add in as well, you've got usually the, oh sorry, that's going to be Wall's End, isn't it? Because that's where the wall ends, with the River Tyne there. But it's a similar, this is a cavalry fort rather than an infantry fort. Very similar design, but again, it's barrack and stable blocks, it's barrack blocks, it's storage space, it's all of those things rather than, yes, you've got your gateways, yes, you've got your walls, but it isn't primarily defensive. It's a place where the army lives. So let's think about a few questions to ask. The first one is basic but important, and that's more than anything else, the debate over this, even if the two sides of the debate, the Roman army as an occupying force that didn't have a clue about planning, or the Roman army as this very methodical defensive force, whatever your view on that, it's helped the debate to allow us to think about just what information does an emperor have, how does he make decisions, on what basis, on what principles. So you look at intelligence, communications, we then need to consider the capacity. Now that's partly how are Roman aristocrats able to think about this, because obviously an emperor comes from that elite. Your governors of all major provinces apart from Egypt are going to be senators. So they are very much part of the Roman aristocratic tradition, that form of education. What do they think? How do they think? And how do they respond to the sort of problems that we're dealing with? You've then got the cultural aspect. They're aristocrats, the whole question of glory, of power, some of the things hinted at by Corbulo. Then you come to the bigger question. This empire hasn't happened because the Romans went out to be terribly nice to everyone. It hasn't happened because of their duty to civilize the world, they might see it. They have been aggressive. How aggressive do they stay? How oppressive are they? Is it an army of defense or an army of occupation? So let's start with knowledge, and never too late to have asterisks in. So putting a table, one of the few maps surviving from the ancient world, very different in its layout to the modern maps that we looked at before that are to scale. The whole point of a modern map is that you can measure between any points on it and you will have a sense of what that distance is. This is different. It tells you the routes. You've got these routes between places, and it marks down with the notations how long it will take you to get from one to another. So if you want to get from A to B, that's fine. But if you want to go cross-country from there to here, there's no sense of scale, no sense of proportion. It's completely useless. On the other hand, unless you have a very detailed map, that's still going to be useless anyway. You don't go on holiday and find your way around, I don't know, Rome or somewhere with a globe, or a large scale, a map of Italy. You want something specific. So it's a way of conveying information. This is the only one really to survive. You can argue about different types of plans. Obviously, the Romans are very big on their surveying of land, which they do quite precisely to scale because they're very jealous about who owns what. So there may be different ways of doing things, and they can clearly lay out a fort, a city, something like that, very precisely, and have a sense of the relation of one object to another, but that's a rather different thing. Worth reminding ourselves that it's been made a lot easier by Google Maps and things like that, and Google Earth and all this sort of stuff, but even comparatively recently, you could go on an archaeological expedition to parts of Europe and there wouldn't be a detailed map of the area, because it simply didn't exist. Britain only had the Ordnance Survey because of the threat of revolutionary France. Before that, nothing of that sort was needed. That was the first real attempt to map an entire country to scale and in great detail. And even that wasn't finished until after Napoleon had been exiled for the second time and all this sort of thing. So it didn't come along in time. And Britain was unusual in being fully mapped. So while we assume, oh yeah, everybody should have a map, everybody should be able to look something up and know with great detail precisely what the landscape is like 1,000 miles away, that's a very modern thing. And even now, you don't always have the right map at the right time. So we're back to one of our very stylized coffee table book maps. Again, this is back to the Death of Nero one, but it's a very different concept of what a map is. But again, it wouldn't tell, you had something like this, you wouldn't be able to look, you'd have a rough idea because, oh, dear me, you might know what's in Britain, but it isn't telling you much about hills, mountains, even, you've got the bigger rivers, but that's about it. It doesn't tell you roads, any of that sort of thing. So actually, the Punic table has, in some ways, more useful detail for telling you how long it would take to move an individual or an army from this province to that province. It's just a different way of presenting information. But there is this concept of how people perceive the world. Now let's go back to Augustus and a bit from Strabo, when it's a summary of the Queen of Ethiopia, a war with her and the Roman troops in Egypt. Eventually the Romans claimed to win a few victories, and they talked to the ambassadors. Her ambassadors were told by the prefect of Egypt they must go to Caesar Augustus, and they protested they did not know who Caesar was or where they should have to go to find him, and were given an escort to the emperor, who happened to be in the island of Samos when they reached him. One vital thing, and this is just as true when you talk about Roman imperialism in the Republic, when you start to talk about strategy and this thing, remember the Romans are only one side involved. There are lots of other people out there, and they've got ideas of their own. They don't simply react to the Romans. And their perception, we're talking about Roman perceptions of the world, how big it is, where provinces are in relation to each other, different communities outside, of which there are very, very many. It's only in the east where you face the Parthians and the Sasanian Persians later on, where there's one big empire kingdom. You might get Dacia, that's quite big, fairly centralized, but nevertheless, you've got the rest of the Danube frontier and then the Rhine everywhere else. The pattern in most of the world is of much lower level socio-political organization, of in many cases tribes, and within those tribes there are probably divisions as well. So you've also got their way of thinking about things. They don't necessarily know how big the Roman Empire is. Now, one bit of archaeology that's interesting, we can look at something like Hadrian's Wall, and there's obviously a debate about whether it's clearly built to a plan which is changed at several stages in fairly rapid succession, before it's actually been finished. They make major changes to design. So for instance, the first one is to add forts physically to the wall itself. Now, Hadrian comes to Britain in 122, at most for several months. And you've had a long debate over when the wall starts. Does he come to inspect something that's already there and say, they show him a few bits and he says, I like this, build me more, or, oh, I don't like that, is that why there's some of the changes? Or does he come to Britain, gallop up to northern Britain, look at a bit of grassy field and say, I know, build me an 80-mile long wall there, what a great idea, and then just go away? How much does he know? That's a big debate. It appears to be a very rigid design. You have every Roman mile, you have what we call a mile castle. We don't know what the Romans called them, with a gateway through the wall. Between those mile castles, you have two turrets, except here. This is at Steel Rig. The mile castle we looked at is just over that way, where there's actually a third. And the reason there's a third, it's very logical when you go to the spot. If you just had there's one a bit further on up there, there would be this little ravine along here where anybody wanting to sneak past would be invisible to people on the wall. So if you're going to put an extra guard tower in, that's the place to put it, because otherwise it's an obvious point where people could sneak through. So you've got an apparently rigid plan, which seems to be imposed from someone at a distance who doesn't know the ground, but here, and this was only discovered in the 70s, it's been adapted. Someone's actually said, oh, that doesn't work here, let's add in an extra one. There may be more of these oddities along the wall that we've yet to discover. Mile Castle 37, just to the west of Housesteads. Here you have one of these mile castles with its gateway. Now, you're probably just about to see where that long grass is. If you walked briskly out beyond that, once you get past that grass, you're going to fall down about 50 feet down a cliff. There is one mile castle that they never bothered to build a northern gate because it actually does open onto a cliff. But this one, you've got your archway. It's the best preserved archway of any of these on the wall. And then later on in one of the rebuildings, they decided, well, we're not likely to send an army or a patrol or a wagon out there, are we? So let's just fill this in. We'll leave one doorway so we can go out and clean the wall outside and we can look out. But do we really need a big gate? No, we don't. So here again is local adaptation to a plan that may have come from a great distance. So it's showing two things, really. One, that you might get ideas imposed upon an army in a province that are based on a lack of detailed knowledge of the area, but also that they're not so dumb that they can't work it out for themselves, that actually we don't need this, let's adapt it. Another one, the mile castles are supposed to be run Roman mile apart, except they're not. So for instance here, and this comes from David Woolscroft's book on signalling on the Roman wall, this is where the mile castle actually is. That's where it should be, several hundred meters away. If it's there, somebody can raise a flag or put smoke signals up and they can actually be seen by a tower which is right by the fort at Vindolanda, which is your nearest garrison, because obviously if there's a problem, you want to tell somebody who can help you. If you put it there, you can't. And the pattern all the way along, where he's looked at it, is that, and this is reflected elsewhere in Germany as well, they actually adjust what appears to be a rigid pattern isn't, because someone has actually worked out what you can see from this position, and then this is actually the best place to do it. Now that's the sort of detail that you don't expect the Emperor Hadrian to have worked out for himself, and why should he, but that there is sufficient flexibility. The army goes and does this. So it suggests a rational approach to this. But again, this is one of the metapiece from Adam Clissi down by the Black Sea in southern Romania, and shows this family of possibly Bastani or some form of tribespeople from beyond the Danube migrating or moving around in their ox cart. Comes back to this point, there's lots of people out there. So one of the big problems about the idea of grand strategy is that it's like a lot of historical debates, it can end up becoming an exercise in labeling and defining things, in that the scholar decides this is what grand strategy means, creates their definition, and then looks at the Romans, anybody else, and says, well, they can't do this and that, therefore they can't have grand strategy. Now that's proved something to yourself, but it hasn't actually told us anything terribly useful. It's rather like, I remember being at a conference back in about 2000 on grand strategy, funnily enough, organised by the American government, and one of the scholars there who gave a terrific talk on the Royal Navy in the before and during the First World War talked about how he and his students had worked out a definition for empire, and they concluded the British Empire wasn't an empire, which it's not what it says on the tin, but what does that actually tell you? Well, we need to understand not what something isn't, but what it actually is. An interesting feature of that conference was that all the different periods looked at, none of the states involved where there was any sense of long-term ambitions and strategy, none of them got the situation they were planning or expecting for. Things developed in a different way. Comes back to these chaps, there's somebody else out there, often lots of other people. So the idea that a state can plan in this very organised way and expect to make the future fit this plan is a bit implausible in the first place. Now let's consider the capacity of the Romans to know about things and to act upon that information. So let's just quickly remind ourselves of what the Roman army is. You have, under the Principate, it rises to about 30 legions. Legions about 5,000 men on paper, 150,000 men in theory. Each legion is commanded by a legatus, who is a senator, about 30-ish. He's often been praetor by this time. You then have the auxiliaries, the non-citizen troops, who are organised in, a legion has 10 cohorts, so they're organised as individual cohorts. There's a a difference in the way they're structured. There's more cavalry there. Some of them are mixed units of infantry and cavalry. Tacitus tells us one of those throwaway lines that then scholars expand upon because it's the best we've got, that at the death of Augustus there are about as many auxiliaries as there are legionaries. Generally, estimates put the auxiliary as increasing in size and becoming larger. They're commanded by equestrians. They're not brigaded into any sort of legion-sized organization. All of this comes into provincial army commands with a legatus Augusti, a former consul usually in most of the bigger provinces in charge, so another senator. It's a mixed army. It's got all this snazzy equipment. You've got your legionaries, this bit of Trajan's column, your Eastern archers there, various forms of auxiliaries and allied troops. It's organized, it's disciplined, it's permanent. It isn't always as neat as it should be. It's not often you get a chance to use a picture taken in a cafe at a museum. But anyway, this is at one of the Roman Army Museum at Carvoren. It's based on the writing tablet from Vindelander, which gives a strength report of this cohort of Tungrians in the early 90s AD, something like that. So generation before Hadrian's Wall. There's 750 odd men altogether, but less than a third are actually at Vindelander. So the group in yellow are there, but some of them are in hospital. 6 men vulnerati, wounded or possibly injured, because do the Romans really have a word that means injured accidentally rather than injured in battle? It might be a hint of small-scale fighting, or they were cleaning their gladius and it went off in their hand. This group in red, they're at a place called Coria, which is almost certainly Corbridge. So the main bulk of your unit is somewhere else. It's at Corbridge, isn't that far away. It's only, dozen or so miles to the east, but nevertheless they're not at the base, and then others dotted around all over the province. That's the pattern whenever we get the documentation for the Roman army. Units are not at their theoretical strength. They're nearly always smaller than they should be, and they've got detachments here, there, and everywhere, particularly if they're officers. Centurions like to get posted somewhere else to a nice cushy job on somebody's staff or doing something else. So you get in Josephus, there's this classic description of the Roman army as this army that's permanently training. There's the throwaway line, their battles are like bloodless drills, and their drills are like bloody battles, and all this sort of thing. And never do they run, never are they panicked by, and he goes through this whole list of things. And then in his actual narrative of the campaign, he describes occasions when they do all the things that he says they don't, because they do panic, they do run away, they are confused, they make mistakes. It's a regular, professional, permanent army. It cannot be, like any human institution, permanently fine-tuned so that it's in perfect condition to go off and fight. And it's also doing lots of other things. However, it is a highly bureaucratic army. So from Egypt, we've got, enter in the records, according to regular procedure, a horse, 4 years old, reddish, masked, without brands, approved by me, assign it to Julius Bassus, trooper of, oh sorry, this is from Jura Europus, it's not from Egypt. So you've got a horse being enrolled on the strength of a unit, this cohort at Jura Europus on the Euphrates, the value of the horse, and the date when it's all done. Whether you're a person or an animal, any way you're involved in the Roman army, your career is followed on paper or on papyrus or writing tablet, whatever it might be. So from your enlistment to your discharge, even if you're an animal. And that's at the unit level, but there is an impression from the records that if you were, say, the governor of the province, you could get the information. You wanted to know, okay, how many men, how many horses have you got? Where are they? What are they doing? How many are sick? That information was there. Now, how far, whether an emperor would routinely or not want to find this out, is another matter, but at provincial level, it's certainly there. This career of a centurion suggests that actually you've got things stretching beyond just the provincial level. This is a chap called Petronius Fortunatus, who served for no less than 50 years in the Roman army, according to his own inscription. He's 4 years, scholars would often describe it in the ranks, but actually he's never an ordinary soldier as far as we can tell. He does 4 years and he goes in Cunicularius, quite junior, it's a clerk in the headquarters of the unit. Tesserarius, Optio and Signifer, those are the centurion sort of deputies, century level. 46 years as centurions in no less than 13 legions. It's all based on the inscription that he set up. was set up to commemorate him. His son and his namesake, who dies aged 35, he's listed as serving 6 years in the army, centurion in 2 legions. Now, again, temptation is to digress on this because it's just interesting, but you have to ask questions about this. Does this fellow join when he's 29 and die when he's 35? Or do they only choose to mention the time when he was centurion? Or has he been a centurion for 6 years and then left the army and died at the age of 35? Not clear from the inscription. Let's just go through Fortunatus's 13 legions. First one, First Italica, Moesia on the Danube. Second one, Sixth Ferrata, that's in Syria. First Minervia, Lower Germany, so again that's northern Germany. Pannonia again with 10th Gemina, back on the Danube. Second Augusta in Britain, Caelian, this time just near where I live. Third Augusta then, it sounds as if it should be together, but that's in Numidia, so you're going to North Africa. Third Gallica, back to Syria. 30th Ulpia, Lower Germany. 6th Victrix, back in Britain again. Cyrenaica in Arabia. 15th Apollinaris in Cappadocia. Parthica, probably in Italy, but it tends to follow the emperor around whatever he's doing. It's one of Septimius Severus's formations. And then First Adjutrix, that we don't quite know. It's somewhere it's in one of the Pannonias this time. Now, a couple of questions that, again, this raises. First of all, if we were being really cynical, the simple answer is that he goes to each of these legions. So this fellow has zipped around, okay, it's 46 years, so he hasn't gone that quickly. He's about 3 to 4 years, if it's assuming a similar amount of time in each one. He's actually physically gone to all of these areas, so he's basically travelled most of the Roman Empire, at least the military provinces. Or you could see, well, it's actually, he's just getting steps in promotion, but somebody who particularly, Fortunatus is going to be in his late 60s by the time he's in some of these posted. How active is he going to be at that time? Is he some sort of specialist as an engineer, a trainer, administrator, whatever it might be? And he's being posted around for those purposes. And is he simply given the ranks? As far as we know, no one is ever given a commission as centurion that is not associated with a particular unit and a place within that unit. That's as far as we know. So it might be that if you want to promote Fortunatus, there's a vacancy in this legion that's out there in Britain, but he never actually has to go to Britain. He's just on its books because, like the cafe diagram from Carvoren, he's on the books of the unit, but he's actually posted somewhere else doing something useful. The point of all this, to emphasize, is that we have no way of knowing, there's no evidence for how this is all organized. Centurions are important people. There's 1,800 of them about in the empire, legionary centurions. When, for instance, Calpurnius Piso, after the death of Germanicus, goes back to Syria and he starts promoting some centurions and cashiering others, this is seen in the Senatus Consultum, in Tacitus' account, as a mark of starting a civil war. Centurions are very important people. They are the ones that lead the mutinies of legions in the histories, for instance, when you declare against the current emperor. They also have substantial privileges. If you get to be primus pilus, the senior centurion of a legion, you automatically become an equestrian. Some centurions are equestrians already, and you can move on to a career path that can lead you to procurator, command, Roman cohorts, that sort of thing. But what it means is that someone is tracing all of this. If there's only 60 centurions in every legion, there's a set number of posts, and they know who is holding that post, and probably they know where they are, where they should be. Now, if you think of the Roman army as this, the Roman Empire as this basically rather primitive, simplistic state, how is this possible? What we're seeing here is the shadow of some organization, some administrative structure, which we don't know about and we don't fully understand. But it does mean we perhaps should be a little bit cautious about underestimating the Roman capacity to gather information and collate information and then deal with it. Right, culture. Aelius Aristides, the army is a wall around the empire. And then Appian says similar things. Herodian emphasizes, these are all people writing considerably later, in 2nd or 3rd centuries, this idea that we've conquered this empire, but now the army is there to protect us all against the ravening barbarians from outside. I can't remember why I put that in, but it's a nice picture. You have the culture of the senatorial commander. Oh yeah, let's just remind ourselves of one thing. Augustus travelled around a lot. He spends more of his reign outside Italy than he does there. Hadrian does the same. A lot of emperors pretty much stay where they are. Someone like Claudius will make the effort to come to Britain for maybe 2 weeks at the most before going home as part of the invasion. He's there at Canulodonum, but he quickly clears off. Most emperors are not inclined to spend years campaigning away. That changes, it's a big pattern. However, they are advised by the Senate. There's 600 or so senators. If we just think about a province like Britain, that we always tend to think of as relatively unimportant. You've got 3 legions in Britain for much of the time. Later in the 2nd century, Britain will be divided into 2 provinces. But let's stick with it while it's just 1. You've got a governor who's a senator. You've got 3 legions, each commanded by a senator at a younger stage in his career. So that's 4. And within each of those legions, you have your senior tribune, who is somebody embarking on a senatorial career, and if he lives long enough, will go on to that. So that's 7 people at any one time from Rome's elite are here in Britain. And the same proportions in any of the military provinces. A lot of senators go to these places. So it does mean that when you think about, well, how much does the Senate know? We tend to, particularly those critics of the sort of rational strategy behind everything, will look at the literature that exists and the comments that are made about the planning for a campaign, or the ethnic descriptions you get in the Germania or something like that. How relatively simplistic those are, how much they draw on stereotypes that go back to Herodotus and probably beyond. This sense of other groups who do weird things, and this is the way they think. And that's what the Britons are like, or that's what the Germans are like, or the Numidians, or whoever it happens to be. We don't tend to get technical literature surviving from the ancient world. If you think of as an example, you've got Vitruvius writing there, 1st century, who clearly refers to and draws upon lots of very technical works about architecture. He refers to books written by people who designed the Parthenon that don't survive. We don't tend to get the dull stuff because it wasn't worth copying out again and again. Doesn't mean it wasn't there. So that there may be more rather duller but more informative books out there than what survives, but also you have direct experience of many of these regions within the Senate. The Senate is basically a group of people who, during the course of their career, if they're ambitious, they are going to travel the empire. Those same people who've had the military posts will probably have gone to senatorial provinces as well. And that's even without, particularly when you're young, going on the staff of a relative for experience. So there's actually quite a lot of people who know rather more about the world there in Rome than we might at first think. It's easy to forget these things. Sometimes we forget the numbers. Now this is coming on to 214. Oh dear, we're running horribly over time. Again, we see the bits added onto the empire, but it hasn't changed that much. Unfortunately, the double page spread couldn't quite fit on that little prod there. So they do know more. So this is the commander's house, partially reconstructed at South Shields. We sometimes, again, forget that the average, or at least what we estimate as the average of these postings, is about 3 years. So you've gone to a lot of different places. There are a lot of people out there with direct experience. Now, of course, you can go somewhere as your classic tourist and not work out how the place ticks at all. Nevertheless, again, we come back to, here's the Saalburg, the fort, the Kaiser, partially reconstructed in Germany. When we start to look at these forts, we need to remember something else. Our senators move around and they go on jobs at different parts. I emphasised when we looked at those plans of forts, the design of them, they're where the soldiers live. Barracks, places where you sleep, where you rest. You don't have to be there all the time. It's like you've got your room in college, but if you did a plan of where you actually went during the course of a week, you're not going to spend, yes, you'll sleep there, but you'll do lots of other stuff as well. And if you think of your time, say you're an undergraduate in a university, you are going to spend the bulk of 3 or 4 years in that place, but if it's Oxford, it's not even the majority of the year. You're doing other things elsewhere. Don't forget that the people living here are not living on archaeological time, where we'll think of 10 years as a short period of time for a site, because that's the way our evidence presented, that's the way we date things. We'll date things to be late Flavian, early Trajanic, and forget that that's several years. A lot can happen in several years. The garrison that's in this fort can be like the diagram of the one from the cafe. They could be scattered out doing all sorts of different jobs. But even if they were mostly there, and say they spend most of the winter there, there's one of the Vindlander tablets, the prefect of the Batavians refers to Vindlander as his hiberni, his winter quarters. Now, it might be consciously archaizing, but he might also think, well, that's where we go for the bit of the year when it isn't much fun going out and about and when campaigns don't happen. Perhaps training doesn't happen. But these people can move. We look at where the forts are on a map, and the immediate assumption is, like a castle, well, it's there because there's something to protect there. There's something vital, or there's something where you can threaten someone from there. But it's actually where you live. You can go and do stuff elsewhere. If the troops within one of those forts marched even 10 miles a day, which is pretty slow, then in a week they're 70 miles away. So our little dots along a line, again, people don't tend to take in the fact that usually lines of forts are on a river or they're on a road or both. They are places where you can communicate, where you can move, where it's easy to gather them together and send them off to do something. So we need to be asking slightly different questions of this. I'll rush through the attack or defense. Here's the archaeological park at Xanten, the reconstructed town walls there. If they want to, the Romans can build quite formidable defensive things. They can build, this is the Caewent. These are, the wall is late 3rd century, the towers are 4th century that are added onto it. You can see the Romans were perfectly capable of building very strong fortifications. They tend to do it much later on. They don't have to, but they're also their walls. This is from Trajan's column, and it's not entirely clear if this is a Dacian fortification or a Roman fortification. There's a row of heads, some of them which look like skulls, on posts, on stakes on the rampart. They've, of course, found the skull that was clearly on the rampart at Vindlander that fell into the ditch and was buried. So it's something the Romans sometimes do as well. A lot of these things are about intimidation, are about projecting power and the idea of power. But when it comes to simple attack and defense, it just isn't as simple as that. The empire is very big. It is reasonable to assume, and there is good evidence, that at some periods in some places, the army is there to put down a rebellion, perhaps to deter any rebellion from happening. So there's often 2 legions near Alexandria. Alexandria is not under any external threat, but it is prone to rioting and intercommunal violence. Judea has a stronger garrison than it seems to justify from any external threat. So this clearly happens. On the other hand, overall, the army is pretty small in proportion to the empire. Therefore, it's hard to see how it could have held down the entire empire by force. There's not enough soldiers around. And there are concentrations. Britain has an apparently disproportionately large army stationed here, and an awful lot of it for a long time is up in the north, Hadrian's Wall, Antonine Wall, that area. So there's something going on. Comes back to the point made at the beginning. Roman soldiers are not just something that allow the emperor to feel strong, they're also a threat. You don't, apart from the reluctance of any government to pay for an army it doesn't need because it's expensive, in the Roman case they are dangerous. And some decisions are made clearly on the basis of how this affects the emperor's position. So Domitian, for instance, ends the practice where in some bases you had 2 legions in the same fortress. He splits those up so there's only ever 1. And the explanation given by Suetonius is because the treasury that represented, the pay chest basically for those units, was so big that it was a very good source of funds for anybody with ambitions to overthrow the emperor. So less directly the threat of the soldiers than the money they represent. Later on, in later antiquity, we'll come back to this in the future, the structuring of provinces, the reduction of a big province like Britain into 4 or 5 smaller ones, and then within each of those provinces dividing civil and military authority, doesn't seem to be to do with efficiency. It seems to be to do with making sure that nobody has too much power and can rebel against you. But that's an issue for another day. There we go. This is an inscription from the 1st century where a governor talks about the various tasks he's done. Again, it's presented in an aristocratic way. I've done these things. This is honourable. I've, protected the status of the Roman people. But it's also quite logical in that he does things and deals with problems, even though quite a proportion of his army has been sent to Armenia on an expedition, so he hasn't got all the troops he should have. It's a very traditional thing. And again, tradition reminds us that if we start trying to downplay the Romans' capacity for rational planning, then all of those passages in Livy looking at what the Senate is doing each year in the Republic, where it decides how many provinces we're going to have, who's going to go there, are we going to extend anybody's command, make them a proconsul, a propraetor, what troops are they going to have? Do we disband an army? Do we raise a new one? All of that is done by the very amateur body of 300 or so senators, 600 from Sulla onwards, that are sitting there debating and doing this every 12 months. So actually there is evidence for a lot more systematic. It doesn't necessarily mean they're planning that far ahead. They may well be reacting to things, and this is a theme we'll deal with more next time when we look at frontiers in more detail, and we look at the whole question of what sort of warfare is going on, and we look at raiding and skirmishing and that sort of thing.